Formula One racing is an intense, physically demanding game full of challenges. It is an extreme connection between a man and a machine, a union that crosses all kinds of speed limits, which is why Formula One is one of the most watched sports worldwide. If you think Formula One is just any other sport out there, well, you're wrong. Because this one combines diverse sporting elements into something very remarkable. For most people, it might look like an individual sport, but there's a lot going on behind the scenes, with a fair share of drama and competition between teammates as well as competitors. The actual race itself is dangerous for the driver, but it's a spectacle for the audience. If all of this sounds new to you, you might be new to the entire Formula One racing, and you are at the right place because in this video, we cover the A to Z of Formula One racing, which is why you need to stick around till the end, because we don't want you to miss out on anything. Ever since people started exploring the different ways to use their vehicles, a race made perfect sense, especially when technology improved and when there were more people behind the steering wheel. Racing in its earliest form started as early as 1894 in France, as a way of competing and marketing the cars built by brands. You might be curious, why exactly do we have the name Formula One for this racing? Well, the name comes from a set of rules that participating cars and drivers must follow. In motorsport, the term formula refers to a set of rules and regulations adopted by the organizers, and as for the number 1, it was added to recognize the championship in the premier category in motorsport. Now, when it comes to the history of Formula One racing, Formula One's rich history was delayed by World War II. But right after that, Formula One became an international auto racing sport, making it the biggest single-seat, open-wheel and open cockpit professional motor racing contest, with everything governed by an international body known as FIA, or the Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile, or the International Automobile Federation. Originally, Europe had several races during the 1920s and 30s from other similar racing competitions, but it was only in 1946 when the FIA standardized racing rules, which then led to the foundation of Formula One racing that we all know today. The inaugural Formula One World Drivers' Championship was held in 1950, which was the first World Championship Series ever to be held. Prior to 1950, the idea for a Formula One Championship began with a race that was held in 1946 known as the Turin Grand Prix. The ultimate goal of these competitions were to determine the best drivers and the best vehicle manufacturers. Apart from the World Championship Series, there were other non-championship Formula One races, but it was difficult to run the entire race because the running costs for these races were extremely high. As a result, they were discontinued after 1983. Giuseppe Farina with his Alfa Romeo won the first World Championship for drivers in 1950, defeating his teammate Juan Manuel Fangio, but Fangio then went on to win titles in 1951, 54, 55, 56, and 57. And this record of 5 World Championship titles remained for about 45 years. And that's when we had Michael Schumacher, who took his 6th title in 2003. Maybe that was the time when people started getting bored of Michael Schumacher winning all the time, but Fangio's streak was interrupted after an injury by 2-time champion Alberto Ascari of Ferrari. When it comes to the cars, the first few seasons featured pre-war cars like Alfa Romeo's 158. These were front-engined vehicles with narrow tires and 1.5-liter supercharged or a 4.5-liter naturally aspirated engines. The 1952 and 1953 World Championships were conducted as per Formula 2 regulations for smaller, less powerful cars because of the lack of Formula 1 cars that were available back then. For the 1954 race, Formula 1 engines were limited to 2.5 liters, and that's when Mercedes-Benz introduced their advanced W196. And that changed everything back in the day, because this engine had several innovations like desmodromic valves and fuel injection in a streamlined bodywork. So it makes a lot of sense why the Formula 1 drivers won the championship for 2 years before the team withdrew from all sport events because of the 1955 Le Mans disaster. Now, if this is your first time hearing about the 1955 Le Mans disaster, well, this was a major crash that happened on 11th of June 1955 during the 24 hours of Le Mans motor race at Circuit de la Sarthe in Le Mans, South France. There were so many debates on who to blame for the disaster, and that is a topic for another video. But this clearly shows that Formula One is one of the most dangerous sporting events out there, where the lives of the drivers are at stake. The Constructors' Championship was introduced in 1958. The history of Formula 1 could be a whole another video, so drop a comment down below if you want us to do a detailed history of Formula 1. Speaking of safety, Formula 1 is also a sport where safety is #1 priority. Well, it should be obvious because Formula 1 is the fastest motorsport on the planet that we know today, as these cars move faster than 200 miles per hour, accelerating from 0 to 60 in under 2 seconds while generating about 1,000 horsepower. This means Formula 1 is no alien to tragedies, especially during its early days with so many casualties that included drivers and spectators because of the high-speed crashes, which is why a lot of research and development went into making Formula 1 much safer than it was before. Which is why today we have some of the best cars and safety gears for the drivers. The helmets that the Formula 1 drivers use weigh about 1.2 kilograms, and fun fact, these helmets are painted by hand. Not that it adds to the safety, but it's a fun little detail to know. These helmets are also fire resistant and they meet the highest standards of safety. Then you have the head and neck support, or harness. The purpose of harness is to protect the driver's vertebra and also prevent the collision of head to the steering wheel in case of an accident. This is made using carbon fiber material and it is attached to the seat belt in the cockpit, coupled with elastic straps. Harness was introduced by the FIA after a major collision in 1995 Australian Grand Prix. When it comes to clothing, you might have seen the F1 drivers coming out of their burning cars with little to no damage to the suits. This is because the racing suits are fire resistant, and these multi-layered suits match the specifications of NASA. But things were not always like this. The first cars that participated in the very first Formula 1 World Championship race in England were designed for speed, with front engines and drum brakes without any medical backup or any form of safety net. It makes sense because it was just the inception of something bigger, and people back in the day might not have the right technology to consider safety as a priority. But ever since then, the FIA kept on making amendments on their safety regulations. Back in 1952, FIA made cork helmets compulsory by their FIA. Then in 1955, the FIA introduced disc brakes, and we also had the very first Formula 1 competitor to drive a mid-engine car rather than a front-engine car. In 1961, we had rollover bars introduced for the very first time. In 1963, the FIA introduced flag signals. Drivers were also required to wear fireproof suits and cockpits were restructured to allow drivers to get out more quickly. In 1969, double fire extinguishing systems were introduced. In the 1970s, fans were forced to stay at least 3 meters away from the track, and a separation wall was made mandatory. In 1975, fireproof clothing became mandatory, and during the same year, FIA also introduced headsets and a fire extinguisher on board. In 1980, we had the very first track hospital, and from 1986, the FIA also had a rescue helicopter as well. In 1990, the cars were equipped with large rear-view mirrors and adjustable steering wheel. Rescue training for drivers also became compulsory during the same year. In 1992, FIA introduced stricter crash test norms, and in 1994, all of the members of the refilling crew were required to wear fireproof clothing. Fast forward to the year 2001, the cockpit walls were built higher, and in 2015, the complete chassis of the vehicles were protected by Zillion, which is basically a bulletproof protection, and the list goes on. Now let's address the elephant in the room, because this is the moment you have been waiting for, especially if you are new to Formula 1 racing. How exactly does a Formula 1 race work? The Formula 1 Grand Prix often takes place on weekends, which is about 3 days. That's Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And different types of events take place on each of these 3 days. On Friday, there are a few practice sessions, and on Saturday, there are a few more practice sessions along with a qualifying session, and Sunday is the main event, that is the race. Now, every Formula 1 race starts with a warm-up lap called the formation lap. And then you have the pit lanes that are opened for this purpose for about 30 minutes before the actual race begins. The pit lanes are the tracks away from the grid and parallel to start and finish line. It is during this time drivers are free to take any number of warm-ups without actually going onto the grid. Once the pit lane closes, the drivers must take their places on the grid in their qualifying order. Once all the cars are in position, the race will begin with the starting lights. The starting lights are 10 red lights and 5 pairs of columns. Each column lights one after the other with an interval of 1 second from left to right. And once all the 5 columns are illuminated, they stay that way for a few seconds and then all of them are turned off. That's when the race begins. Let's say that due to some unforeseen condition, if the races are interrupted, then the 5 red lights illuminate again, but won't turn off. Instead, orange lights are lit up, and races are restarted. And just like any other sporting event out there, the drivers who finish first, second, and third positions at the end of the race are awarded with trophies. A constructor's trophy is also presented to the winner's team. For each Formula 1 World Championship, 10 teams each with 2 cars can participate. So that is a total of 20 cars that can enter competition. But FIA regulations allow a limit of 26 cars for the championship. Each team can have a maximum of 4 drivers per season. There are several support staff with every Formula 1 team, and it is the support staff that plays a vital role in the team's success. So it's obvious that Formula 1 racing is not just drivers and cars, it's an entire team effort. A minimum total distance of a Grand Prix, which includes all the predefined number of laps, must be around 305 kilometers or 190 miles. This is a standard distance for all races except for Monaco Grand Prix, which is about 260 kilometers or just 160 miles, considering the fact that Monaco is a very small country. Every Formula 1 Grand Prix begins with 3 practice sessions, with 2 of them held on Friday, each of about 90 minutes long, one in the morning, and then you have another one in the afternoon. The last practice session will be taking place on Saturday. Regular drivers, along with the third driver, can participate in this session. These third drivers are usually newcomers who are trying to gain experience on the track and exposure to such events. Then you have the qualifying session, which takes place on the second day. The second day, which is a Saturday, begins with a third practice session in the morning for a duration of about an hour. The qualifying session follows in the afternoon, and this is used to determine the starting order for the race the next day. The qualifying session lasts for 1 hour, and it is divided into 3 knockout stages. You have Q1, Q2, Q3, with small intervals in between. The Q1 has a duration of 18 minutes, and this is the only time when all the 20 cars race on the circuit. Out of this, the 5 slowest cars are eliminated, and they occupy places 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20 on the grid. Then you have Q2, which begins after a brief interval with 15 cars and lasts about 15 minutes. Again, the same procedure is repeated, where 5 slowest cars are eliminated and they occupy places 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15 on the grid. And finally, you have the Q3, which begins with the remaining cars, and it's about 12 minutes long. These are the cars that hold their positions in the remaining 10 positions on the grid. The fastest driver will occupy the pole position, which happens to be the position on the grid that is considered best to begin a game. And finally, you have the main event of the Grand Prix, the race day, which is held on a Sunday afternoon. Formula 1 racing consists of 2 awards. You have the Drivers' Championship Award, which is awarded to the driver who scored the most points in the Formula 1 World Championship season. Keep in mind that Formula 1 has produced some of the world's greatest sportsmen and legends, and things will be that way for the foreseeable future. Then you have the Constructor Championship Award. This is the award that is given to the constructor who scores the most number of points in a Formula 1 World Championship season. Now, there are 2 cases for this award. The first case is that the chassis and the engine of a car is constructed by the same entity, then the car's make is the name of that one constructor, for example like Toyota or Ferrari. Then the Constructors' Championship is given to that single constructor. Then we have the second case, where the chassis and engine of the car is constructed by 2 separate entities. Then the car's make is also taken as 2 separate makes, and the points scored individually. In that case, the Constructors' Championship is given to the maker of the chassis. Now, it's time to answer the biggest question. How does Formula 1 make money? The truth is, most participating teams in Formula 1 actually don't make a lot of money from Formula 1 itself. But they are participating in Formula 1 mainly for one reason, and that's to market their brand and to create brand awareness. This makes a lot of sense because according to a report that Formula 1 released, the annual audience figures following the 2021 World Championship season, which also included the 3 new sprint events at 3 races and the title battle between Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen. The season finale in Abu Dhabi attracted 108.7 million viewers, which is 29% higher than the viewers for the same race held in 2020. The cumulative TV audience for 2021 was about 1.55 billion, which is 4% up from the 2020 season. Formula 1 also saw a strong audience for the season opener in Bahrain, which was about 84.5 million. And for the 3 sprint weekend events at Silverstone, the number of viewers were 79.5 million. For Monza, it was 8.4 million viewers. and for Sao Paulo, it was 82.1 million. So this is the reason why, even if brands are not making so much money with Formula 1, they can still generate a lot of revenue using Formula 1 as an advertising platform for their brand. And considering the huge number of audience, it makes a lot of sense for them to do the same. Formula 1 typically generates revenue from investments, sale of tickets and merchandise, hosting and racing fees, advertising and promotion fees, anti-dilution fund, sponsorships and partnerships, and championship prize money. Formula 1 also makes money from broadcasting fees and TV commercial rights. So these are, as of now, the primary sources of revenue for Formula 1 racing. Ultimately, Formula 1 is a combination of science, fiction, and fantasy. Formula 1 would be the greatest sport to ever exist, as everything in here is uncertain because anything can happen at the racetrack. The track shows no mercy even to the best teams out there, making the Formula 1 drivers superhumans. Even though there is a misconception that Formula racing is a single sport, because all these drivers do is sit in a chair doing exactly what people do on their daily commute. Well, if that's what you thought Formula 1 was all about, we think you changed your mind now. At least we hope so, because Formula 1 races are just a pool of capable people who are able to withstand the harsh reality of the racing track, and that pool of people is quite small. What makes this sport even more exciting is the fact that the group of people who get behind the wheels of an F1 car is even smaller. This is also a game where engineers are as important as athletes, because athletes alone can't do anything. A driver only spends about 6.5 hours during a typical race weekend, but before the car hits the track, the race team engineers spend so many hours preparing the car for each individual track. Engineers spend a lot of time reading sensors, making necessary adjustments, reviewing driver feedback, and then making more adjustments, and figuring out how to extract the maximum performance out of their vehicle within the FIA guidelines. In the end, it's a beautiful combination of science and cutting-edge technology, considering the fact that the engineers have to spend a lot of time tuning the aerodynamics, thermodynamics, and quantum mechanics, and computers for fluid dynamics for Formula 1 racing.